Well, welcome again. We continue our Methodism 101 study. This is session 3 and the last session, and we're going to be dealing with polity and governance during this time. Now, don't turn it off yet. I know that may not seem very appealing or attractive, polity and governance, but it is interesting. I invite you to continue watching. You can go and get the handouts for this session. They're in the description box. There's a link for that underneath this video. Get something to write with, get something to write on. Let us be in prayer together. Gracious God, we give you thanks. And Lord, as we turn our attention to, especially in this study, the kind of nuts and bolts about ways in which we organize ourselves and ways in which we accomplish your business, Lord, we pray that you would keep us ever mindful that this is your church and we are simply stewards of it, and that you would give us wisdom and courage in knowing how to best care for your church so that we can be the body of Christ for the world that needs it so much. Bless this time, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, so you might be able, in the last study, we talked about sort of the theology that differentiates some of us from other Christian groups. And so there's some theology that differentiates us from Roman Catholicism to Methodism, or there's some theology and some understanding of God and way that we understand God that separates the Presbyterian Church from the Methodist Church. But if you look at all the sort of churches from within the family tree, so if you looked at the Episcopalian Church in the U.S., or you look at the Methodist Church, or the African Methodist AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, or if you looked at Free Methodist, or you looked at Nazarene Church, all of those are within the Wesleyan family tree. Our theology, the way we understand God, the way we teach God, the way we talk about God, for all of those that I just named is pretty similar. I mean, very little nuances that you might find. Instead, what separates those groups is not the theology, but rather it is the polity, the way we govern ourselves. And so the Nazarenes govern themselves different than United Methodists govern ourselves. Our theology might be the same. I mean, for most people, you could go into most any Nazarene church and then go to any Methodist church, and you could feel like the message and the Bible teaching was from the same family, that it was almost the same because our theology is almost the same, but we would organize ourselves very differently. And so that's what separates us as United Methodists from some other denominations, especially those that are more theologically aligned with us. So let's talk about that polity or governance. The United Methodists are a representative democracy, a global representative democracy. So think the U.S. government, not the Senate. Think of the U.S. House of Representatives, right? California has many more delegates, many more members of the U.S. House of Representatives than does, say, the state of Maine. And that's true because we have more people than the state of Maine has. And that is how the United Methodist Church largely is organized. So there is every 4 years, there's a worldwide, a global gathering of leaders that have been elected from within their regions to represent United Methodist and to make decisions at what we call our General Conference. And half of those people are clergy and half of those people are laity. Every time that we make decisions as a denomination in this representative system, half of the people who are there are laity and half of the people are clergy. So it's not that the pastors, the ordained clergy, make all the decisions for our denomination. It's half and half. And we share that responsibility and that privilege and that burden. And so if Methodism is, if there's more Methodist in the southern states of the U.S., which there are in the Bible Belt, than there are in the western states, then at that global gathering, more people from the southern states of the U.S. get elected to go to that gathering. And if there are more United Methodists in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, than there are in the Western states, then there's more people from sub-Saharan Africa who are at that global meeting than there are in the representing the Western states. So it's just like the House of Representatives. Every 4 years it gets reset in terms of the number of people and the number of delegates that get assigned from different regions. It's roughly a little bit under 1,000 delegates that are elected, and the distribution of those delegates depends on members of churches, how many members we have. And so that's on the global scale how governance is designed, and then it just sort of trickles down. So here in California, we are part of what's called the California Pacific Annual Conference that covers Southern California, sort of the central coast of California, Paso Robles, south all the way to the border. Then Hawaii, Saipan, and Guam are a part of the California Pacific Conference. And again, it is representative. So Chula Vista is a little bit larger of a church. So there's 4 people from Chula Vista, 4 lay people from Chula Vista who are elected to go and to represent at the annual meeting. Whereas if you're in a smaller church, you might only have 1 person who's elected to go and represent your church at that annual gathering. But it's always a representative. And the current challenge for us is that for generations now, for decades, the majority of the people who were at that global gathering called General Conference were from the United States. And so largely the United States, the voting bloc of the United States, made the decisions for the church. There are other global parts of the church. The United Methodist Church is very active in the Philippines. It's very active in Africa. There's a good portion sort of in Eastern Europe, some in Western Europe. So it's active in these different places, but those places were always in the minority. Well, right now, the church, the United Methodist Church, is growing fastest in Africa. So every 4 years, as we decide who's going to make up that delegation, there's more and more people from Africa that are making up that delegation. So the vote used to be like this many people from the U.S. and this many people from around the world, and now it's changing. And of course, that has some ramifications to it, and that's part of the reason why we're right now in a sort of denominational dilemma, because different parts of the world view, for example, ordination of women different. Different parts of the world view things like educational standards in different ways. Different parts of the world view LGBTQ issues in different ways. And if you're just simply a representative democracy, it doesn't matter who might have the most money or who might have the most historical precedent. What matters is who has the most people today. That's part of our challenge. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the structure of our church is what we call an episcopal structure, that there is leadership, there is a hierarchy of leadership. Over each annual conference, there is a bishop, the episcopacy, and the bishop has a certain amount of power, primarily with making appointments, but the bishop has a certain amount of power and makes certain decisions that then trickle down or impact the local congregation. Some of you might have friends that are from congregational churches, that if you want to hire a pastor, whatever decision is made, it's made on the congregational level. That you're an individual church on the corner of that street, and the only people who ever make any decisions that would impact your church are the people who go to that church or the elected leaders of that church. But we're a part of an episcopal system, which means we're a part of a much larger structure, and there's certain decisions by being United Methodist that we have given to the episcopacy or to leadership in different ways. So let me show you some of the effects of that episcopal system. One of the effects is that we are a connectional church. So together, worldwide, we support missionaries around the world. We have a board of missions. We support seminaries that educate our pastors around the world. We support and we have an arm of our denomination that's called the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR, UMCOR is how often that is said, UMCOR. And UMCOR is a relief agency that is on the ground all over the world providing relief. So tsunamis in 2004 in Southeast Asia, Hurricane Katrina 2005, in the Gulf states of the U.S., fires that ravage the West. UMCOR responds to all of those situations. It is the relief agency of our denomination. So as a local church on the corner of East H and Paseo Ranchero, there can be some global crisis, a huge earthquake that happens in some part of the world, and thousands of people lose their lives. And we can take an offering and we can send, a few hundred or a few $1,000s there, and it would make some impact, sure. But because we are a part of a connectional church, our funding has already supported this relief agency part of our denomination. And so on our behalf, they're already there serving and doing good work. And so we can collectively have a greater impact than we could just have if we were individual churches. And so we're a connectional church. We have missionaries. We as a church, we can't support missionaries on every continent around the world. But because we're a connectional church, we do support missionaries on every continent around the world, because we have already done that through our denominational giving. And so one of the effects of an Episcopal system is that we are a connectional church. We're not just an individual church here on the corner, that occupies some corner in Chula Vista. We are combined with every United Methodist church around the world. We have our little piece of the mission field that we're responsible for, but then collectively we're responsible for the world. As John Wesley said, the world is my parish, that we're ministering to the entire world because we are this connectional church. Another effect of an Episcopal system is that we are a bureaucracy. There's no doubt about it. And some of you work for the federal government. You know what it means to work for a bureaucracy. You know that there can be some wonderful things about that, and there can be some challenges with that. It is very difficult to change a huge bureaucracy, and we're facing that dilemma right now. There are some great collective work that can be done by the bureaucracy, but also you can get lost in the midst of it. And too often what happens is a bureaucracy becomes inward focused and inward looking. And that giant institution only serves to keep themselves alive rather than to minister to the people outside or perform whatever it is that their task was that they originally started, right? A movement is focused not on yourself, but on accomplishing something in the world. And too often an institution becomes focused on keeping itself alive. And so that's a tough pill to swallow as a church, that we would ever fall prey to losing the movement of Jesus and simply worrying about keeping ourselves alive. That's why you hear us talk a lot at FUMC CV about the ministry that we are to do outside the walls of the church. That, yeah, we got to keep our campus alive, and we got to keep the buildings in good shape, and we got to keep the staff paid and all of that kind of stuff. But we do it all so that we can fulfill the ministry which we have been called. We don't do it simply to keep the institution alive. And in bureaucracy, that's the challenge. In a bureaucracy is that you lose touch with the movement and you become just an institution trying to keep yourself afloat. And we don't want to become that. Another effect of this Episcopal system and ways that we see it in our denomination is what's called apportionments. Apportionments are what the way funding happens in the church is the bureaucracy, the top doesn't fund it down, and the money doesn't trickle down. So our church, our local church, is not funded by the denomination. We are 100% funded by the work that we do on campus, by the people who give. We are 100% funded by you. And the money that our members give or that our ministries generate. So, for example, for us, our preschool generates funding that then supports the overall church ministries. We are funded locally. And then a portion of our funding locally, about 10%, so sort of think of this tithe idea. We ask families to tithe, and then about 10% of our funding is then given to support the work of the denomination. So rather than us supporting ministries all over the world, we're supporting ministries through our apportionments. Rather than us having our own relief agency, we're supporting relief agency through our apportionments. Rather than us developing all of our own sort of curriculum and that sort of stuff for Bible studies, and rather than us having our own university and seminaries to educate our clergy, we're supporting that through our apportionments. And so our apportionments come from the local church to support the other parts of the larger church, the connection, and those pieces at the connection then help to fund different initiatives or help to resource different initiatives at the local level. So sometimes money might come back, but more often resources would come back. And so publishing houses and curriculum and relief agency and missionaries and those sorts of things, ministries that we support outside. So a good example of that right now is our internship program. You might know that we have an internship program called the Elijah Collective. It's designed to support and encourage college students at San Diego State to explore their calling and their passion and their purpose in life. And so we have 4 interns that are working on our campus right now, and then there's a monthly campus conversation that we have at San Diego State. We've been doing it for about a little over almost 2 years now, and it's just been a great thing and wonderful to see. Our apportionments support what's called the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, which is an arm of our denomination. And they're an arm of our denomination that's particularly concerned with helping future generations discern their call to ministry, whether that's lay ministry or ordained and clergy ministry. So the money that we have to run the Elijah Collective comes from a grant that they're giving back to a number of local churches to help us do some ministry and expand ministry. So our apportionments have paid for that piece of the organization, and now that piece of the organization is resourcing us as a local church to be able to do this kind of ministry with college students in our community. So that's a way that apportionments work. So we see that that's a direct effect that upon local churches in terms of our Episcopal system. Another very visible effect upon the local church, given our Episcopal system, is what's called the itinerant system for clergy. That our clergy serve on an itinerancy, which means they itinerate or move according to the appointment of the bishop. So when I'm ordained, I apply to be ordained into a particular region. Our region is California Pacific, as I said earlier. So Southern California, Hawaii, Saipan, Guam. Once I'm ordained into that region, if I remain in good standing, I'm guaranteed an appointment. We have about 370 churches in that region. I'm guaranteed an appointment. It may not necessarily be the appointment I want or I think I'd be best at. What I do is I say I want to be ordained into this region, and I will serve according to the needs of the church in that region. So some of you who have performed military service, you know this, that you serve at the needs of the Navy. So the Navy wants you to go here, you go there. Or the Navy wants you to go here, you go there. Well, the same is true within our region. So the bishop can't call me up and say, Brian, we want you to go to, Wisconsin or something. But I could transfer there if I wanted to into that conference, into that United Methodist conference. But within my conference, I serve at the need of the church, and the bishop is the one who decides where I will serve and where my gifts are most needed for the denomination. So when I came to Chula Vista 10 years ago, we were happy in Santa Maria, very happy serving there, wanted to stay there. The bishop at the time decided that my gifts were most needed here in the church in Chula Vista, that's where I would best serve the whole of the church. And we serve on an annual basis. So every year we are appointed. Now they can move us every single year, but obviously they wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be good for pastoral families, and that wouldn't be good for local churches. The average stay is probably 7 to 8 years in one place. The larger the church staff, the longer one would stay. And so I've been here 10 years, and my predecessor was here a dozen years, and it wouldn't surprise me that there's a few more years here, because if you change the sort of leader of the staff, then you can assume that the staff is going to turn over. And so every 3 or 4 years, a complete turnover of the staff wouldn't be healthy. But we serve on the itinerant system. So every year, the congregation, the staff parish relations committee, that's the personnel committee, we call it the SPRC, gets to do an evaluation of the pastor. These are people who are elected by the church, elected leaders by the church. They do an evaluation of the pastor. Then as a part of that evaluation, they say, we would like our pastor to return to us, or we would like a different pastor. Every year, the pastors have the opportunity to fill out that paperwork to say, I'm open to a move, I definitely want to move, or I don't want to move this year. And then the bishop takes that information and has to sort of assign pastors. So there's a church over here, pastor moves, that creates another move, and it's sort of this puzzle of the bishop knowing the needs of the church and knowing the gifts of the pastor and trying to match those as best that she or he can do. From the very beginning, Methodism has had an itinerant system. It was important to Wesley, and my guess is we will forever have an itinerant system as Methodists. That's just the way we do things. A couple of things that undergird the system, why we do this. One, it provides a vigor of leadership. So Wesley believed from the very beginning that moving pastors frequently, that leaving a pastor in one place too long could lead to complacency, that they get to know the people and they're sort of saying the same thing over again, and everyone gets comfortable with one another, and nothing really happens. And that moving the pastors quite frequently can lead to a vigor in leadership. Now, research shows today that the most stable and healthiest churches generally have long-term appointed leadership. That the longer appointments tend to be healthier for churches, and part of that is just because our culture has changed. So it used to be, if you think in the 50s and 60s, people grew up and then they moved into, they grew up in a church and they didn't necessarily move away from home. They stayed in their home. They stayed in their hometown, and their parents were leaders in the church. Then they sort of graduated into leaders of the church, and the institutional memory of the church was really held by those members. Well, we are a much our culture moves around a lot more than that today, and so institutional memory of the church becomes difficult if all the lay people and all the clergy are moving all the time. And so, but that was the original idea. We don't want people to get complacent either with your pastor, or we don't want pastors to get complacent with your people, and so we move them from time to time, and that challenges us in our spirit, which is true. Second, an itinerant system rather than a congregational system allows for prophetic leadership to be preached by the clergy. There are times in which clergy might might challenge a congregation and make people in the congregation uncomfortable. They might challenge people and make the whole congregation uncomfortable. And if you're in a congregational system, well, simply the Sunday afternoon, the leaders of that congregation meet together. Then you call the pastor Sunday night and you say, we've taken a vote and you're no longer our pastor. You're fired. Now, I went to college in the South. And in the South, in the United Methodist Church, during segregation and then bringing the schools back together and the civil rights movement, there were white Methodist preachers who were preaching messages of racial integration and racial reconciliation, and some of those white preachers were not liked by some of their congregations. And if they lived in a congregational system, then essentially they could have fired their preachers for saying that. But in the Episcopal system, they can't. And so what it does allow for is it allows for a freedom of prophetic leadership for the clergy to know that they can push on a certain issue, they can preach on a social justice issue, they can push the congregation to a new place of understanding or being without being fired by the people of that congregation who are made uncomfortable. I mean, as we know, faith in Jesus should make us uncomfortable. Right? I mean, Jesus was always pushing people to care for others on the margin. And they didn't often like it. But he pushed them to change their culture, to change their ways, to reach new people, to include new groups of people. That was a prophetic leadership. And it's in that spirit that the itinerancy helps our current preachers to stay in a prophetic leadership role, as opposed to fearing for their jobs if they preach something that is more prophetic in nature. Also, the itinerant system helps us to with the idea of equipping the saints. The understanding is that the preachers, the pastors before me in this church, that they had certain gifts, and they came in and they shared those gifts, their gifts, with the leaders of the church, and sort of those gifts kind of trickle down. Then the congregation begins to incorporate those gifts into their spirituality and the way they do Christianity. Then I come along and I have different gifts, and I share those gifts with the congregation, and those gifts begin to trickle down, and they become a part of the DNA of our congregation. And then someday I'll be appointed somewhere else, and someone will follow me, and they'll have different gifts than I have, and they will impart those gifts to the congregation. And so there's an equipping of the saints as different pastors come in and out of the life of the church, and the gifts of those pastors become known and practiced within the spirituality of that particular congregation. And so those are three different things: vigor of leadership, prophetic leadership, equipping the saints, that are really the hallmarks of the itinerant system. So those things are all the effects of the Episcopal system. And let me just say sort of big picture ideas about our polity and governance and how this works. One, there is certainly a challenge for us right now in being a global democratic denomination. I always joke, we're the only global democratic denomination, at least that I know of. If you're ever the only one doing something, I think there's really two things that might be at play. One is people are going, you guys are a bunch of dummies, because we've all tried that and it doesn't work, and you're still trying it and banging your head against a wall doing it. Or people, the only ones who are doing something are super innovative, and no one else had thought of it, and they're trying it. Now, there are other global denominations. The Roman Catholic Church is a global denomination. They are not democratic. The Pope says something, and that's what happens. It's not a vote, but we are a global democratic denomination. And so that creates, as I said earlier, all kinds of challenges. Some, you have growing number of people groups in some parts of the world versus shrinking number of people groups in other parts of the world. The groups that are shrinking were the ones that used to be in power and make the majority of decisions. The ones that are growing are the new power base and making new decisions. And they have two very different ways of looking at many, many issues. And so we're really coming to this place of equilibrium in which we're going to have to make some decisions. And the decision may be to divide. The decision may be to sort of nationalize in some way our denomination. And so in the western states, you can make these sorts of decisions, and in the southern states, you can make these decisions, and in Africa, this, and in the Philippines, this, and sort of make more things sort of in the spirit of that liberty. So there are some things that all of us stick to, and then there are other things that based on your ministry context, you can decide. I'm not exactly sure where it's going to go. We've been in this battle for a long time. It's largely around LGBTQ issues, full inclusion of those folks or not. And when we say full inclusion, we mean marriage, our clergy performing weddings, using our campuses for those sacred services, and ordination of LGBTQ persons. And so we're going to see where we go. There was supposed to be in May a general conference, so the global meeting of this Democratic representative denomination. But that meeting has now been postponed because of COVID-19 pandemic. I haven't seen exactly when they're going to do it again. I think probably a year from now, next spring, and it may be there that these decisions are made. What I have told our leadership in our church is that I don't know. We can't predict exactly what's going to happen as a denomination. We've had people leave our church on both sides, the conservative and the liberal side of LGBTQ issues. We've had people leave who are in the middle, and that issue is not all that important to them, but they don't like that there's division within the church, the global church or the local church. It's been a difficult season. What I tell our staff and our leaders is that we're going to do everything that we think we're supposed to do in the name of Christ to reach people in this community, to grow our social holiness and to deepen our personal piety, and that will yield the strongest church that we can be. And no matter what leaders of the denomination choose, if we're a really strong church, we're going to weather that storm. Now, if we just sit around waiting for the denomination to decide what they're going to do, then we will atrophy as a church. We're not going to do that. We're going to, in bold ways, we're going to move forward and be the church that we believe that God wants us to be. And then wherever the denomination comes out, we'll figure what our part is in that. But we'll be a strong, healthy church in doing that. And so that's part of the challenge moving forward. And I'll tell you the even greater challenge, and I'll end with this. The even greater challenge for us is that we as a denomination, as a church, we were really born in a Christian century, right? Where the culture in the United States was a Christian, it was a churched culture. So some of you who are older adults in the 40s and 50s or teens in the 40s and 50s, you know that the question in that day wasn't, do you go to church? The question was, where do you go to church? The assumption was that you were a Christian and that you went to church. And the work of the church then was to welcome the Christians who moved into town. And the way to grow a church was you bought a piece of land and you put a sign out front, and you built a building. And everyone who was new into town, who resonated with that denomination, would come. You did a really good job of taking care of the inside ministries of the church, and it attracted people. So the sort of strongest church, the strongest youth program, or the strongest children's program, or the strongest music program, people were pre-inclined to attend a church, and so they just looked around for the church that attracted them the most. That's what it meant to be a church in a Christian culture. Well, we don't live in a Christian culture anymore. The majority of people in our world do not claim Christianity, do not claim any kind of faith tradition. And the idea that people are born into a Christian family and they just sort of learn Christianity as they go through Sunday school and vacation Bible school and youth group and summer camp, and eventually they are deposited as an adult Christian leader in your congregation, that idea is gone. We see people all the time at church that they arrive at church and they're 35, 40 years old and they have zero Christian experience. They have no idea who Christ is. And we have to begin fresh for them. More than that, though, what the church has to do today is figure out how to convince people in the world who have no connection to God that they need a connection to God. So now the work of the church is you got to do things good inside. You got to do good youth ministry and good children's ministry and good music ministry and good preaching. You got to do all that well and care for your members. But then there's also the larger segment of people outside in the world who they could care less about youth ministry or music ministry or children's ministry. They have no idea why it is that they need to be a part of a church. They have no idea why it is important in their life to be rooted and connected to God. And so there's this whole other body of work that we also have to do now, and that is to help convince those people why God needs to be the central piece of their life. That's an even bigger challenge than our denominational challenge, that we were born as a denomination, born into a Christian culture, and we have to figure out how to survive in a post-Christian world. Born in a Christian world where people were inclined to go to church. Now survive in a post-Christian world where people do not understand who God is or why they have a need for God in their life. That's a very different kind of church, a very different kind of institution that's needed for this world as compared to this world. But yet, largely, we still have this institution. How do we transition our institution so that we can reach these folks over here? That's the work we're about, and that part, for me, part of the answer to that is the last study, Methodist theology, the way we understand God, we talk about God. It is, in my mind, the best ways that Christian can do that. And we have this rich theological history, this rich understanding of this conversation of God's grace with us, our freedom to respond to that grace. For me, that's the answer. But we got to figure out how to do that. So big questions, big ideas, and they will necessitate some big answers that we will continue working on together. I hope this study's been helpful to you, help you understand a little bit about Methodism, why you fit here at this church, or why you might fit, if you're watching this somewhere else, why you might fit in a Methodist church around you. So God bless you. Thank you for joining us. Remember, take care of yourselves, take care of others. Know that God is taking care of us during this season. God bless.